Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Tonya and I like to talk about all things fantasy book related on this channel. And today we're going to be talking just a little bit more about what actually makes a book a fantasy book. There's a few different subgenres of fantasy out there, and within those subgenres there's also some additional categories of fantasy. So if you're newer to fantasy or maybe looking to expand the types of fantasy that you read, I thought this video could be helpful just so you have a better understanding of what actually makes a fantasy book, and some of the options out there. Because all of our taste varies as readers, but I think there is truly a fantasy book that is for everyone. So fantasy itself is a genre of speculative fiction. And if you've never heard of speculative fiction, it basically is a type of fiction book where the setting is somewhere other than the real world, and there's other sort of elements in it, such as either supernatural elements, futuristic elements, or other, fantastical kind of elements like magic or, unicorns, dragons, things like that. Now, within the fantasy genre, there is also a few different subgenres, the two main being high fantasy and low fantasy. So first, we're going to talk about high fantasy, and another name for high fantasy is epic fantasy. And this type of fantasy is set in a completely different world. There's usually some themes in it of epic quests, world-threatening conflicts, and things like magic or, fantastical creatures like dragons or unicorns, anything like that. I would say these books also tend to be longer, and they don't tend to be standalone for the most part, just because, to build that world and the different magic systems and characters, it can take some time to tell that story. So typically for most high fantasy books, but like I said, not all, you'll see that they're going to be a series. And some great examples of high fantasy are The Lord of the Rings, The Wheels of Time by Robert Jordan, any of the books in the Valdemar series by Mercedes Lackey, any of the trilogies in that, those could fall under high fantasy because it is such an in-depth world, along with those, the different magical creatures and the magic itself. The Echo Saga by Philip Contrail, that's what I'm currently reading. That would fall under epic fantasy. So they are ones that you're typically, there's a little more investment needed for high fantasy books, usually just because, like I said, they do range across the series most of the time and tend to be a little bit longer. But I will say high fantasy is my personal favorite. I love that world building and those epic adventures. So if you haven't tried a high fantasy book, I definitely would suggest it, but maybe, not start with something like The Wheel of Time, because that one's pretty in-depth. Maybe start with one like I had mentioned, the Valdemar series by Mercedes Lackey, the Harold Mage trilogy, or really any of those trilogies in there is a good introduction to high fantasy, because they do have all those elements, but the books aren't super long, so they're pretty easy to get into and read. And besides that, she's just such a great writer that it's an easy introductory to a high fantasy or epic fantasy if that's not the typical type of book you read. The next, we're going to talk about low fantasy. Now, low fantasy, those are usually set in a more realistic or typical kind of environment. It doesn't have to be in some separate world. It can be in a world similar to ours. The magic in low fantasy books tends to be more subtle or hidden. And, you still can have magical creatures in a low fantasy book, but it may not be as prevalent, or they may not play as big a part in them as they do in a high fantasy book. Now, that being said, that is not the case for all low fantasy books, but they definitely do tend to be more grounded in reality than a high fantasy book. Now, some examples of low fantasy is Harry Potter. Now, that is, a very long, very involved series, but it does take place in our world. Another great example is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. That's another one that takes place in our world with, some slight differences to allow for the magic, but also a great low fantasy book. And then, along with the high fantasy and low fantasy, there are some different categories within those two subgenres. So the first category we're going to talk about is urban fantasy, and urban fantasy places supernatural or fantastical elements in a contemporary urban affected setting. It usually doesn't require that the author make an entirely separate world for the stories to take place in. Some urban fantasies are in separate worlds, but it's not something they would have to do. You will see, like I said, those modern kind of elements. So there could be cars, there could be guns, there could be, phones, things like that. Some great examples of urban fantasies is the Bedlam Bard series by Mercedes Lackey, and that one we're following around a modern bard. A lot of the series takes place in New York City, and there's elves living among the humans. Now they're usually in some sort of disguise or hidden form, so that the humans don't recognize them, but they are throughout the landscape of the story, either in New York itself or in Underhill. Another great example is the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. I will say when I read the first book in the series, that one was a little tough for me. I don't read a lot of urban fantasy. The Bedlam Bard series was probably one of the few urban fantasies I had enjoyed prior to the Crescent City books, because it's a lot for me to take in. There being things like guns and phones, and with my magic, I prefer the traditional fantasy setting most of the time, but I think you definitely should give urban fantasy a try. If it's a good writer, it's still going to be a great read. So I wouldn't necessarily run away from it just because there are those kind of modern elements in it as well, but it is one that's not for everyone, and sometimes it can take a little getting used to having those modern elements throughout a fantasy book. But if it's the right book, it will work. Then the next two categories that we're going to talk about, I think, have been gaining popularity over the last few years in the fantasy community. The first one being cozy fantasy. Now, cozy fantasy, that's a whole vibe. So it's not only what's in the books, but it's kind of atmospheric where it's something you're settling down to read. You want it to be a relaxing experience. You have your cup of tea or your iced coffee, you have your candle going, or your fireplace scene on the TV, things like that. Things that are just creating kind of a mood. And then within cozy fantasy, what you're going to find is not necessarily huge magic or things of that nature, but you're going to find different themes within a cozy fantasy book. You're going to find themes of community, friendship, found family, just a relaxing kind of experience with more gentle storytelling. Some great examples of cozy fantasy are Legends and Lattes, and that's by Travis Baldree. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies also falls into that cozy fantasy category. The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst, that would be a great example of cozy fantasy. Any of these would be good for someone who doesn't necessarily love the long epic quest, but is still looking for that fantasy experience, something that's just a little more relaxing, a light read. That's what I think of with cozy fantasy. And for me personally, even though I love the high fantasy and those epic quests, a lot of the time it's nice to kind of throw in one of those cozy fantasy books too, just to kind of slow things down, get something that maybe is just, a good reminder about things like friendship, making your family whoever you want your family to be, helping out your community. Those are, I think, great themes that cozy fantasy brings out to everyone. And then the last category we're going to talk about is Romantasy, and I think this one's kind of a controversial one. Controversial. I do not know why I can't say that word right now. A controversial that it causes controversy in the fantasy community. We'll just go with that, and I'll quit trying to say the word because apparently I can't say it today. But that being said, some people look at Romantasy as just smut. And some of it probably is. not all of it. You know, there's all different kind of quote unquote spice levels that can happen in a romance book. But I think what the important thing is for most readers, you're going to want something that, yes, it has the romance. That is one of the main plots that happens in a romantasy book. You have the romance along with those different fantastical elements, either you know, being in a different world, magic, magical creatures. But along with that, the romance is one of the main themes of the book. But you can definitely do that in a way that still tells a story and isn't people just like jumping into bed all the time. Now, the spice level doesn't really bother me in some of these books unless there's like no reason for it. You will find some romantasy books where it seems like they just like fall into bed like every 2 seconds and it's like a big, you know, sex fest for no reason whatsoever, when they haven't actually built a relationship or it doesn't make sense for it to be happening at that point. I think the good romantasy books are ones that tell a great story but still have romance as their main theme. Some great romantasies are Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR series. I think that's a super popular one. The Fourth Wing books by Rebecca Yarros, those are also considered romantasy. Those are super popular. The Legends of Thesmar, those are romantasies that have a great story. Now I will say those are a little higher up on some of the spice level, but when it happens, it typically makes sense that it's happening, and it's done in a way where it doesn't distract from the actual story of the romance and the quest that the characters are on. It kind of fits into the story, even though it would be maybe a little more intense than some people's romance or sex lives maybe. But that's another great example of a romantasy book. Now there's ones that, you know, I think don't do it as well. I recently completed the Blood and Salt series, and that one, by the 4th book, it was basically they were just falling into bed and having sex just for whatever, you know, if the wind blew to the right, then that was a great reason to have sex. And now that kind of romantasy was not the, you know, my favorite. So I can see why there's some controversy within this category of fantasy, but I don't think you should just say, I'm not reading any romantasy book. There are great ones out there with great stories, like Fourth Wing, such as I said. So definitely, if you do like fantasy and you do like romance, I would say go ahead and give romantasy a try. So that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that kind of broadened your horizons on the different kind of fantasy books that are out there and maybe gave you some additional ideas of different kinds of fantasy books you can read, or if you don't read fantasy currently, what may be a good category of fantasy for you to start with. So take care, keep reading, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye!